Somebody in the comments box recently asked if I might produce a video on Fort Belvedere, the private home of King Edward VIII. To be honest, I hesitated for a moment as I thought there would be very little to say, but how wrong was I? Fort Belvedere is a really fascinating building with a history that goes back well beyond its brief connection with Edward in the 1920s and 30s. Fort Belvedere is part of the Crown Estate. It is situated right at the southern end of Windsor Great Park, on a small hill called Shrubs Hill, close to the village of Sunningdale. It is set within 59 acres of grounds, most of which are now set to woodland, although there are also formal gardens, a lake, and a swimming pool, which was built for Edward VIII. It is a rather secluded property. The house originated in the 1750s and owes its existence to George II's third son, William Duke of Cumberland, he who was responsible for putting down the 1745 Jacobite rebellion at the Battle of Culloden. In 1746, his father appointed Cumberland as Ranger of Windsor Great Park, a role that gave him responsibility for the whole of the upkeep of the wider Windsor Castle estate. And Cumberland took up residence in New Lodge, a 17th century house in the Great Park that had served as the Ranger's official residence since the reign of Charles II. It is now known as Cumberland Lodge. On taking up residence at the new lodge, Cumberland commenced ambitious plans to landscape the lower part of the park to form a pleasure garden for Cumberland Lodge. A stream called Virginia Water, named after Elizabeth I, ran through the park, and in 1746 Cumberland had the stream dammed and a lake was formed, an operation that took many years to complete. He was colonel of the 23rd Regiment of Foot, and he appears to have employed the regiment to dig the new serpentine Virginia Water Lake. Such naturalistic, artificial lakes were an important feature of the increasingly popular movement away from architectural formality in garden design towards informality and perfected naturalism, a movement that is generally known as the English landscape garden tradition. And part of that tradition was also the creation within these idealised landscapes of follies, of temples, of garden buildings and eye-catchers. Now, Shrubs Hill, on which Fort Belvedere stands, sticks up just to the south of Virginia Water, and it seemed an obvious place for Cumberland and his garden designers to construct a folly that would form a focal point for a broad vista from Cumberland Lodge. Now, the architect of this work was the man who oversaw the digging of the lake, Henry Flitcroft. Now, Flitcroft was a landscape architect who was in great demand. As well as working at Windsor for Cumberland, he was responsible for the development of the Stourhead Gardens in Wiltshire for the Hoare family, where he constructed various temples and buildings. And Flitcroft's folly on Shrubs Hill took the form of a brick tower with a triangular plan with 3 turrets at the corners, and was designed in a blend of the Gothic and classical style. It had, for example, Gothic battlements and turrets on the roof, but classical windows in the main elevation. Building work started in 1750, and the tower was complete by 1753. And it was that tower that eventually formed the nucleus of Fort Belvedere. Now, the elevated position of the Shrubs Hill Tower was really useful for Cumberland as a place from which he could survey the Great Park. Indeed, from the top of the tower, you could see the whole park and well beyond it. It is said that you could see 7 counties. However, it was primarily intended as a sort of summer house, a place for retreat. It was described when first built as a lodge, and here Cumberland could rest and dine and also enjoy the spectacular view with his guests. And due to the view towards the northeast, the tower became quickly known as the Belvedere, an Italian word that means beautiful view. This print by Thomas Sandby from 1755 shows the tower, which is referred to as the new building on Shrubs Hill, in use by the Duke and his guests. Some are shown peering out the windows of the first-floor chamber, while on the open roof a man with a telescope enjoys those wide-ranging views, including towards Virginia Water with its timber bridge, which can be seen in the background of the print. This second print from 1753 shows the completed structure on top of Shrubs Hill with Virginia Water in the foreground, with the spectacular vessel shown on the water, the Mandarin yacht, a Chinese junk, put there as a pleasure craft by the Duke of Cumberland, on which he used to entertain. Cumberland died in 1765, and his role as ranger was given to his nephew, Prince Henry, the brother of George III, who was created Duke of Cumberland too. In the 1780s, Prince Henry began to develop Virginia Water further, employing the brothers Paul and Thomas Sandby, the latter was appointed Deputy Ranger, to add a cascade and various other buildings around the lake to complement the tower, the Belvedere. A stone bridge was erected across the lake, which made a picturesque approach to the Belvedere, crossing the lake from Cumberland Lodge. The Belvedere was left just as constructed in 1750 as a park folly until the later part of the reign of King George IV. In 1827, King George commissioned his architect, Sir Jeffry Wyatville, to extend and transform the Belvedere Tower. Wyatville was an early exponent of the Gothic Revival style, and he transformed the tower into a mock miniature castle. He heightened the existing tower with a taller turret and added Gothic extensions on 3 sides of this. This included a new single-storey octagonal drawing room that faced towards Virginia Water and an eastern wing containing offices. The whole structure was then covered in stucco to hide the earlier brickwork and to give the impression that the building was built of stone. And this mock stone castle became known as Fort Belvedere. There was just enough space and accommodation in Fort Belvedere for George IV to spend the odd night here or there, and during his last years he did indeed spend a lot of time in this curious little retreat. Part of Wyatville's work was the creation of a gun battery facing towards Virginia Water. This had 31 gun emplacements to house the Duke of Cumberland's brass cannon, which had hitherto been housed at Cumberland Lodge. The cannon, which were mounted on iron gun carriages, had all been made at Woolwich between 1729 and 49. Wyatville constructed a little Gothic cottage linked to the main house by an arch in order to house a retired soldier who would act as a bombardier. Indeed, there was a resident bombardier at Fort Belvedere from 1828 until 1910, when the last occupant of that post, Master Gunner Robert Turner, who had been there since 1867, died. And the bombardier's job was to keep all those cannon in good order and to fire them for gun salutes on royal birthdays and other occasions. Here is Master Gunner Robert Turner in action towards the end of the 19th century, just letting off one of those cannon. The gunfire from the toy fort was often answered from a miniature frigate called the Royal Adelaide that William IV had launched on Virginia Water in 1834. Queen Victoria and her family also used the fort as a retreat from the confines of court life, and the Queen would often take tea in this picturesque little place. The main part of Fort Belvedere didn't become a permanent residence until 1912, following the death 2 years earlier of Bombardier Turner. It was at this point transformed into a grace and favour residence for a courtier, Sir Malcolm Murray, who was the comptroller of the household to Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, the third son of Queen Victoria. Fort Belvedere was convenient as it was close to the Prince's residence at Bagshot Park and meant that Murray was close at hand. Between 1911 and 1912, the fort was extended somewhat, with a new service wing erected that linked the old Bombardier's house to the main house. and Murray would remain in residence until 1929, when he was appointed Deputy Ranger of Windsor Great Park and moved into the much more commodious Ranger's Lodge. Murray's departure in 1929 left Fort Belvedere empty, but not for very long. That year, it was given by King George V to his eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales. Edward, who was then 33, had been living up to that point in York House in St James's Palace, which afforded him very little privacy. The prince was still unmarried, and his private affairs were complex to say the least, and Fort Belvedere would provide him with the seclusion he needed to carry on with his private life, which involved, at times, carrying on with other men's wives. Before Edward moved in, further alterations were made to Fort Belvedere, including the fitting of modern bathrooms, and as we'll see in a moment when we take a peek inside, a new bedroom suite for the prince. This was rather unusually on the ground floor, right next to the main entrance and facing towards the driveway. Not a spot that I would have chosen. Now, there are a few photographs that show the interior of Fort Belvedere during the time of Edward's residence there. During his time, the principal bedroom in the house was on the first floor, and it was known as the Queen's bedroom, as Queen Victoria had occasionally slept there. It occupied an octagonal space within the upper floor of Cumberland's original triangular tower. However, it also extended out into a rectangular addition to the northeast that had been built by Wyatville for King George IV. In the 1930s, this rectangular addition was used as a dressing room, and it had French windows that led out onto a balcony on top of the roof of the octagonal drawing room to benefit from the spectacular views towards Windsor. In Edward's time, this bedroom was dominated by an enormous tester bed topped with great plumes of ostrich feathers, Prince of Wales feathers, and the walls were papered in fine Chinese wallpaper. The three doors in the space led out to the three turrets that were constructed at the corners of Cumberland's tower. One of these contained the staircase, but in Edward's time the other two were converted into bathrooms. I think they still serve that purpose today. They are lavish bathrooms indeed, their ceilings decorated with Rococo plasterwork dating from the 1750s. Descending the stairs from the Queen's bedroom takes you directly to an octagonal room of the same size, which is a hall or lobby. Here is that space in the 1980s, and as you can see, it has a barrel ceiling, and this dates on the 1750s. Doors from the lobby connect to the octagonal drawing room added by Wyatville in the late 1820s. This is entered through a short vestibule which corresponds to the dressing room of the Queen's bedroom above. Here's the octagonal drawing room in the 1950s. The walls you see here appear to be wood panelled, but this was apparently a paint effect. Here's the same room in the 1980s, and the panelling by this stage looks to be the real thing. One of the interesting features of this wonderful space is the fireplace. It appears to have no obvious chimney. Presumably the flue is diverted through the walls, taking some circuitous route before entering a chimney in the turret. If you turn from the octagonal drawing room into the central lobby again and then go right, you would find yourself in Edward's private suite. And this is his bedroom as it was shortly before he became king in 1936. The whole right-hand side of this room with the window is a single-storey addition added to the room in 1929. This bedroom is by no means an ostentatious space. It's very much a bachelor pad. It has a fairly ordinary bed, contrasting with that in the Queen's bedroom above. Hanging behind the bed on the wall is a tapestry with a Tudor coat of arms of the Prince of Wales. Edward would take that tapestry into exile with him, and it would hang behind his bed in Paris until his death in 1972. The furnishings are otherwise rather simple. Built-in furniture with bookcases and a desk and landscape paintings on the wall. The glazed chintz-covered chairs and matching curtains add a light, bright country house feel to the space. Off this space and in the bottom of one of the turrets was Edward's bathroom, fitted out with modern marble fittings. Edward would use the fort as his main residence right up to the death of his father, King George V. On becoming King Edward VIII, he used the fort a lot less, but it was still, to all intents and purposes, his primary place of retreat. And it is, of course, of significance historically as the place where, following a year of crisis, Edward would abdicate the throne in December of 1936. Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere on the 10th of December 1936 in the presence of his three brothers, Albert, Duke of York, who would succeed him as King George VI, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Kent. It was also in the fort that he recorded his famous speech, which was broadcast to Britain and the Empire on the 11th of December. A speech in which he declared that he was unable to bear the burden of kingship without the help and support of the woman he loved. That woman was, of course, Wallis Simpson. She never moved in with Edward to Fort Belvedere, as she was still a married woman, but she had spent considerable time there as their relationship took root. Here she is with Edward, standing outside the front door of the fort. The night of the abdication speech would be Edward's last night at Fort Belvedere, and on the 12th of December 1936 he left England for exile, never to return. Perhaps because of the memories the house had for the monarchy, the house wouldn't be a home again for close to 20 years. It was used by the commissioners of Crown lands as officers during the Second World War, but mostly remained empty and neglected. In 1953, the 99-year lease of the property was offered by the Crown Estate, and in 1955 it was bought by the Duke of Windsor's nephew, the Honourable Gerald Lascelles, the son of Mary, the Princess Royal, and her husband, the Earl of Harwood. Lascelles would undertake significant renovation work, removing some of the offices that had been added by the Duke of Windsor and redecorating the interior under the direction of Stanley Peters. In 1978, Lascelles and his wife Angela divorced, and he sold the lease, which was then bought by the son of the Emir of Dubai. By the early 1980s, the lease had passed to the Canadian billionaire Galen Weston and his wife Hilary. Although they have both died in recent years, the property is still in their family's hands. The freehold of Fort Belvedere is, of course, still held by the Crown Estate, and it is quite plausible in the future that the house might become a royal residence again when the property reverts to the Crown in 2054. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.